Hello, my name is Zahar Karetsky, and this is the Transitions Visions podcast, a podcast series about and for the sustainability transitions community. Today we will talk with Phil Johnstone about war, transitions, and sustainability. And Phil is senior researcher at SPRU in the UK, which is part of the University of Sussex, and is of course a core institute for contemporary transition studies. Phil has recently co-authored a number of papers on war and transitions, where he argues for opening up the black box of war and the military for analysis in the context of transitions. So we will talk about world wars, local conflicts such as the current ones in Ukraine and Gaza. We'll talk about deep transitions and what it all means for transitions theory and practice. So war can be a very sensitive topic, especially now in the autumn of 2023, but we try to leave our emotions outside and focus on transitions theory. So enjoy this episode and stay tuned for more transitions visions in the future. Hi, Phil. We're now with Phil Johnstone, senior researcher at SPRU in Sussex. Hi, Phil.
Hi, glad to be here.
Yeah. Now, I got intrigued by your recent paper on, actually a series of papers on war and transitions. It's an interesting, very kind of topical if you're now in 2023. But maybe first, as a general opening, what got you even interested in the topic of war and transitions?
Well, it's a good question. And I've realized actually when I think about it myself that it perhaps goes back further than I recognize. I think when I got my first postdoc, it was on a project called Discontinuation in Technological Systems. Peter Stegmaier was the PI, and I was working with Andy Sterling. We were doing a case study on discontinuing nuclear power, and we're looking at Germany and the UK. And we found it very interesting, basically, that Germany was phasing out nuclear power and the UK wasn't. And the puzzle was that the German nuclear industry is far better performing. The UK has a far better renewables resource and essentially a really badly performing nuclear industry. So it didn't make much sense why the UK was so persistent with this technology. And what we found through our research is that the military and the UK's commitments to military nuclear power are a key driver of civil nuclear power, because through civil nuclear power you sustain supply chains and skills and resources that are necessary for the UK to have military nuclear things. So essentially civil nuclear subsidizes military nuclear. So I got interested in that. And then the Deep Transitions History Project came along, and with Johann Scott and Lara Kanga, and they were looking for someone to look specifically at the role of world wars in past transitions. And so I began doing that. But an additional thing, it's a very long answer, but I realized that there's always been an interest there because actually my views of politics in the world, I think, were very much shaped at an early age, imprinted, if you will, by the experience of the Iraq War in the UK. And it was a very early lesson for me that there's a sort of area of policy that often democracy does not necessarily reach. And we protested against the war. Millions of people, young people, went on strike, left school, and went to a protest, and still the war went ahead. So I suppose that was a kind of early influence on me wanting to understand this sort of murky world of military affairs, I suppose.
Yeah, I want to ask you more about that a bit later. But you mentioned deep transitions already. So, and of course, you're a big part of that theoretically as well. You write a lot on this. So, and one of the papers that you wrote, you know that sudden large-scale shocks, such as wars, are not given enough attention in transitions theory. And so could we have a little bit of a discussion about deep transitions first? What is exactly a deep transition?
Yeah, sure. A deep transition is different to normal transitions, I think, in two clear ways. And one is about time and one is about multiple systems. So the deep transitions approach looks at change over very long periods of time, the late 18th century and the birth of industrial modernity, essentially. And it combines the multi-level perspective with Carlota Perez's focus on great surges of development, which are these long waves of economic development. And the deep transitions posits that these long histories are the consequence of the building up of rules in single systems that then spreads to multiple systems. And over time, a shared direction occurs where multiple systems are guided in a similar direction. So a key rule is an imperative to use fossil fuels, for example, that originated and then it kind of came to dominate food, mobility, energy, of course. And the deep transitions pays attention to this very long-term change. And unlike Carlota Perez, who focuses on discontinuities between surges, the deep transitions emphasizes continuity across this very long time period. So there's the two differences. It's looking at a longer time period that transitions usually looks at, and it looks at multiple rather than single systems.
And the transition is towards something.
Yes. So the first deep transition was the culmination of industrial modernity. It was this society where we had this greatly expanding wealth, but it came with consequences because it was dependent on fossil fuels, environmentally destructive practices. And now we are perhaps at the beginnings of a second deep transition, which is really a transition that's guided by principles of sustainability that fundamentally challenge some of the unsustainable practices that built up in the first deep transition. But of course, this is, a point of debate at the moment. I think there's a number of different directionalities that are going on vis-a-vis digitalization, the lingering influence of the fossil fuel regime, but perhaps also this emerging second deep transition to sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the transition towards sustainability, is that a surge or is that a second deep transition?
Well, the idea is that this would be a fundamental rupture in industrial modernity. So it is something that is setting a new course over the very long term. But sticking to the theory, it will be probably based on surges as well. So the idea is that we might be in the first or second surge of a second deep transition to sustainability.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of kind of rhyme in deep transitions theory with other historical approaches, such as the Marx approach. But it's kind of a more relevant turn, I guess, the deep transitions has. Would you agree?
Yeah, compared to kind of conventional kind of long histories, you mean? Or? Yeah, I mean, I think the unique contribution of the deep transition is, there's been accounts, for example, Marxian accounts that are focused on economic revolutions. You have sort of social accounts focused on democracy or the Enlightenment or these there's different vantage points to look at these long histories, but the deep transitions takes a socio-technical approach specifically. So that's its unique contribution, and it's focused on the interaction always between society and technology as the key focus, and this focus on socio-technical systems as the unit of analysis, as the building blocks of the analysis, be it energy, food, mobility, and all these kind of things. So I think, yes, it has a lot in common with other historical accounts, but it's also got this unique contribution because of the socio-technical perspective. And as such, it's useful contribution, I think, to sustainability transitions.
And is sustainability, how, I'm wondering what the empirical sort of underpinning of that the sustainability will actually be the next deep transition. I'm thinking of multiplicity of papers recently came out about how unsustainable actually transitions can be.
Yes, that's a really interesting paper, and it makes an excellent point. And actually, we can look at current trends in digitalization. I think is a really good example. So, and that's I've been working on recently. So, there's an incredible amount of hype around digital technologies are going to save resources. They're going to make supply chains more efficient, and they're going to help with the renewable transition and all the rest of it. But actually, what we've seen in the fifth surge since 1970s, dominated by these digital technologies, is yes, okay, things have been made more efficient, but we've had massive rebound effects where the energy use is increasing in terms of the servers and all the infrastructure surrounding computing. We've seen this linear production model still dominating. You can only look at mobile phones and that whole business model, every 2 years get a new phone kind of thing. So we can see the huge impact of rare earth metals and the sort of continuation of colonial kind of north-south relations in terms of resources being extracted and the environmental consequences of these to go into all these lovely shiny digital devices. So that's a good example of something, I think, which is arguably contributing towards unsustainability. However, we do see great progress in terms of the electricity system in particular. So the acceleration of renewables, new rules emerging in the electricity situation around flexibility, demand response, these kind of things. And we do see, going back to digitalization again, there's very interesting discussions around principles of sufficiency as an alternative pathway to understanding and moving towards digitalization rather than efficiency as a priority. So yes, at the moment we are on a kind of we're at a quite worrying trajectory in many ways, but there are positive signs and sort of accelerating niche developments that point towards maybe something else building up.
You already mentioned that you are part of the Deep Transitions Lab, or at least working with researchers there. So, and coming back to your collaboration on war, so so war is important in deep transitions.
Yes.
War is an exogenous event. So what is kind of the importance, whether theoretical or applied? Or applied, I guess we know, but theoretical.
Well, what we've done in the history project of the deep transitions was to look at the First and Second World War, which of course are the biggest wars to have ever occurred in terms of the number of casualties with the Second World War, but the scale of it in terms of the number of countries and everything like that. So we must remember they are quite exceptional. However, often when wars have been mentioned and they're not mentioned often in sustainability transitions, that's changing. There is more discussion of it. However, at the time, they're mentioned as a kind of thing that interrupts a certain pathway. So there's this. Let's take an example. The energy system is going along. Then suddenly there's a First World War, and then after the war, the trajectory has changed somewhat. But there was no discussion, I found, of what was actually happening inside that period of wartime. So we began to look at this, and a proposition was of the deep transitions framework was that the wars they don't just speed up something, but they fundamentally change or influence a particular socio-technical trajectory. And what we did was we examined, me and Katrina McLeish, who's now working in the Foreign Office in the UK, we looked at three systems: food, energy, and mobility. and the First and Second World War, and examined how they changed these systems, essentially based on the rules and how the rules changed. Now, what we found was that the current theories weren't really adequate to grasp the significance of the wars. So we took on an alternative approach, which is this theory of imprinting, socio-technical imprinting. Now, it's a bit different to the usual theories like path dependency and lock-in, because those theories look at historical change in terms of a sequence of events. So it's something happening, then another thing happens, then another thing happens along a timeline. Imprinting places more attention on the conditions of an exceptional sensitive time period. And what this means is that there's so-called different environmental conditions to a certain time period, which influence focal entity, in this case, energy, food, and mobility. So we looked at what was different about wartime to peacetime, and we used literature from history to examine the mechanisms of total war, because these two world wars were total wars in the sense that the entire society was mobilized, not just militaries. And to cut a long story short, these wars fundamentally changed the nature of the socio-technical systems in terms of we saw increasing centralization, increasing intervention from policymakers, rapid shifts to oil, all kinds of things happening. And rather than receding after the war had ended, after the Second World War, these new set of institutional conditions actually continued to form a new kind of institutional arrangement that would go on to influence these socio-technical systems. So the key point that we were making was really that the war was not just an interruption, it fundamentally stamped onto the nature of socio-technical systems and continued to influence them long after the war period was finished.
Yeah. I wonder now if there are other events such as this that's also imprint, leave an imprint on things, on the order.
Well, absolutely, and this is something that would be good to, and we make these points in the paper. Let's research this. There's a framework now. We identify certain mechanisms, and we identify the way that imprinting works, and it's just a case of examining other things. I mean, we did do a working paper on the COVID-19 pandemic because it's a really good example of this idea of imprinting, of there being a different set of environmental conditions. Because let's take the electricity system. So before the COVID-19 lockdowns, we were still people, engineers and so on, who are managing electricity grids and so on. Their main problem is maintaining supply and these kind of things, and making sure there's enough electricity. Suddenly, almost overnight, we were locked down, and in the UK anyway, we saw this incredible drop in electricity use, and suddenly the environment was different. The problem they were dealing with was a lack of demand, and actually renewables within that set of circumstances fared a lot better, and we saw oil struggling, nuclear struggling, and everything like that, because those technologies require high demand to operate, particularly nuclear. So that's an example. The environment was suddenly different. Things that were not possible were suddenly possible. So you could cycle around the city, you could do all these kind of things. So the key question is, of course, did something imprint after the COVID-19 pandemic? And it doesn't look good when you look at it in terms of the usual things we look at in sustainability, because unfortunately car use really did bounce back heavily, and there was an uptick again in fossil fuel use. But I often wonder, the sort of psychological aspects of the lockdowns. Perhaps there may be some imprinting there in terms of the shared experience people had. I mean, a lot of people reconsidered their lives, really. A lot of people changed jobs. A lot of people, there was the Great Resignation. It was a sensitive period where I think a lot of people had time to reflect on their lives, and in some ways, particularly in relation to the world of work, there may be something there of significance that has lasted following the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, in terms of imprinting, it was interesting to observe how a narrative was to return to normal. So that's the opposite of imprinting, perhaps.
Yeah. Indeed. That was very much the call. It was, back to normal. But I don't think there's, I don't think many people would say things are, the world has fundamentally changed. There's a number of reasons for that. It is a poly crisis, and there's been the inflation and the war and everything like that. But I often think, this is just anecdotal, but I often think about it just in relation to what happened with digital finance during COVID. So that was rapidly accelerated because you had this thing, no contact, so money became very unfashionable, certainly in the UK, and very rapidly, we've suddenly got a society where it's actually difficult to pay in hard cash in many places. And I don't think that would have happened in the same way without the pandemic.
Yeah, or teaching online. A lot of courses are still, there's a larger share of online learning than before, I would say, at least in the Netherlands.
Absolutely. Yeah. Same here. Yeah.
And you mentioned that one of the results of the Second World War was the ramping incumbency of fossil fuels. Was that it?
Yes.
One of the results. And it's interesting in terms of, is there a kind of, again, a rhyme or a dichotomy between the next projected surge in the deep transitions theory, which is to go away from fossil fuels? Is that something... would you think about that there's a kind of a mirroring or focus on fossil fuels?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the point is that the Second World War in particular, it laid the foundations for the oil society. And I like that phrase, and it's one that I believe I picked up from the book The Shock of the Anthropocene, which is an excellent book that just has a chapter on war and unsustainability, basically, as a massively overlooked factor in the creation of this thing we call the Anthropocene. Without the Second World War, the mass network of pipelines, shipping, logistics networks spanning the globe, all these kind of things would not have been built at the rate that they were built. So by the end of the Second World War, you suddenly had the infrastructure required to have a global oil regime. And because it was the American state, a lot of it spending was prepared to spend this money because of the wartime situation. So it really accelerated us towards this age of oil. And indeed, part of the challenge of the second deep transition is essentially dealing with the legacy of what you could call this World War II regime, which is these global networks are totally dependent on oil. Military is totally dependent on oil. So, a huge challenge is going to be what do you do about these vast military networks that really are dependent on oil. And there's great work done on trying to account for the carbon emissions of military, which is very difficult to do, but scientists for global responsibility and other people are doing this. And as a single institution, I think the U.S. military is as an institution, one of the biggest CO2 emitters in the world, far greater than many countries combined, and so on. So that's almost a form of deep incumbency, if you will, really, that you have these strategic military assets around the world, very dependent on fossil fuels. And as we try and move towards a second deep transition, these are going to be very challenging things to discuss and figure out, really.
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting facts about the U.S. military. Interesting. Okay, coming back to the world wars,
yes.
I think you mentioned somewhere in the papers that there's a difference between the imprints or the effects of those two wars, the world wars.
Yes.
did you explore why, or could you talk about why there was this difference?
Yes. So what we noticed really was that the mechanisms of total war were the same. So the First World War, we saw the same things. You have demand pressures, you have directionality, you have enhanced policy capacities, and shared sacrifice as sort of four mechanisms that make it fundamentally different to peacetime. And in the First World War, we saw things like the British Navy transitioning to oil. It was one of the first to do so. We saw oil become, for the first time, a strategic asset of military significance because the Allies, as they were called, realized that without access to oil and without maintaining that access of oil produced from the United States to Europe, they would have lost. So that was something that was amplified. We saw a tendency towards centralized electricity grids. So because industrial production needed to increase to produce armaments and these kind of things, engineers had to find a solution to maintaining electricity supply. And the solution was to interconnect local grids. So before, grids had kind of been local and disparate, and then you saw this interconnection process. And so again, the trend towards centralization. We saw things like the Highways Act in the United States. So a big lesson was that they would get the trucks to the coastline as quickly as they would like, bottlenecks built up and so on, because the roads weren't good enough. So after the First World War, they said, we need to build highways. And so the military was a key reason for that, the experiences of the First World War. But what happened was that over time, the imprints kind of, they lasted for a few years and there was policies, but they kind of receded, and we returned to the kind of the market laissez-faire kind of approach in the 20s in many of these countries, and that changed somewhat when we had in the USA anyway with the Great Depression and so on, but it was almost like there was a return to normal. Then the Second World War, it was a much bigger event. Everything took place on a much greater scale. The mobilizing forces were far larger. So it was almost like the event itself had a much bigger effect on the socio-technical systems. And also I think the existential threats that emerged in the Second World War and the sheer scale of the tragedy and the number of people that died, it created this resounding experience across society of never again. That was the call, and it was that call which was pivotal in kind of stabilizing the new institutions surrounding the war. Another key reason, of course, is that by the end of the Second World War, something different had happened. The world had fundamentally changed, and we had suddenly, Britain was no longer a global power. The USA had access to Saudi oil, and there was the Soviet Union. There was two superpowers. So because of the context of the Cold War, again, they never demobilized. That's what happened. There wasn't a demobilization. The American military stayed mobilized. So did Russia, Britain to a certain extent as well, because of that condition of the Cold War. But the Cold War conditions were created out of the very conditions of the Second World War. So the famous idea here is that the bombing of Hiroshima was not the final strike of the Second World War. It was the first strike in the Cold War. And you had this new, fundamentally new condition that had emerged from Second World War. So that's why it stayed after the second and not the first.
Mm-hmm. What about the succession of these two wars? Would that be a factor that they happened quite in a quite a brief time?
I think so, and that's what's amazing about when we were looking at these historical accounts is as soon as the war was kind of getting going, you just see planners and politicians instantly revert back to, we recognize this situation. this is what we have to do because of the First World War. So it was almost like the reaction was a lot quicker, and they more decisively intervened in policy very quickly. So, for example, the UK, just to take one example, it immediately nationalised oil very soon into the war. And that was across the board. They were a lot quicker to act because they'd had that prior experience of, okay, this is what you have to do in the situation of a
You talked about world wars that sort of intensify unsustainability and how the military intensify, or at least, the militaries and their relation to emissions. What about local wars and their relationship with unsustainability?
It's a very good question. There are other people that are doing work on this, so it's important to highlight their work. Jack Davies at Utrecht is doing a PhD that's going to be looking a lot more at transitions and conflict and looking at things in a lot more nuanced way than we did, in a sense, because as you say, we were looking at world wars, quite exceptional. He's looking at conflicts, and I think it becomes a very interesting and challenging question when you're looking at local wars. I mean, there's the issue around sort of boundaries, and at what point is it local, at what point do reverberations kind of occur and spill out into the globe. I think a real challenge is I've read research about looking at, for example, in Yemen, so the war with Saudi Arabia, and how actually what happened in the first few years of that was an acceleration in people using solar power, because energy was regularly being cut off from centralized sources and everything like that. So people were just a DIY kind of installing solar panels. So there's interesting effects that these might have. But then and there's other things to consider. So a war is something that's, it's usually understood as being something officially declared between two states usually, but conflicts that rage for decades and so on. I think in many ways sustainability transitions itself perhaps has the imprints of its founding conditions, in the sense that it was formed in the Netherlands in a consensual democracy at a time of peace. But again, when you're looking at be it Colombia or a number of countries, that have had long-standing issues around paramilitary activity and so on. When you start thinking about sustainability transitions, you've got to kind of think about these actors and these long-term processes. And there it becomes challenging, because the question is that an exogenous thing still? If there has been this situation of conflict in a country that's been going for many decades, and fundamentally touches upon everything, including energy and food and mobility and these kind of things. So I think once we start looking at local wars and so on again, and conflicts, the picture does become more challenging, in the sense that it kind of is not so clear cut where the boundaries are between exogenous and endogenous, and also it really requires us to think differently about these new these different contexts in which transitions happen. So it's not something I've done a lot of work on, but the other thing, of course, is that we've got to start considering how wars, the feedback and the interactions between the climate changing and the potential for conflict and issues around resources and these kind of things, which again may manifest at sort of the more local level rather than these grand events.
Very interesting. Talking about, still climate change, actually. Of course, what may come to mind is that, okay, we had this wartime effort, and we centralized everything towards one goal, and there are calls for doing the same for climate change, to mobilize somehow in a way that is similar to wartime efforts. So, and what is your take on that?
Well, I can see the appeal. I can see the appeal because it's this lovely idea that if we could all unite around this singleness of purpose, because that was the unique thing in the Second World War in particular, in certain countries, it was that people were prepared to share a sacrifice for this singleness of purpose. Nothing mattered except for winning the war. All socio-technical systems were directed towards a singleness of purpose of win the war. That was it. And I can see the appeal for trying to put that to climate change, but there is the grave risks in this, I think, of the securitization discourse, because that's what it is. And securitization discourse relies on an external enemy. So here we have an external enemy. What is the external enemy? CO2. Mm. Okay, well, where's it coming from? It's not a force that's invading. It's something embedded in our very way of life and our environment and our history. It's not something external. It's something to do with us. And it's complicated and it requires serious discussion. And I think that my problem with the securitization, the war against climate change discourse, is that it nullifies discussions of the plural pathways to sustainability. There isn't a single path. There's going to be divergences. There's going to be different values at play. There's going to be important debates to be had. Take something like nuclear power, for example. The debate can get quite silly, I think, because what people can say is climate change is happening and we're all going to die. Therefore, we need to build nuclear power. And people will say, absolutely, because it's low carbon. But that completely misses the nuances of the discussion of, okay, how long does it take to build one? How expensive is it compared to alternatives? What are the other ethical issues surrounding the technology? So it obscures all these very important debates. So what I'm saying is that I can see the appeal of the sort of the war against climate change narrative, but I think actually climate change is something fundamentally different to a war. And also, I'm worried from a sort of democratic perspective as to what it does to public debate. Something else, just to add quickly, is that, of course, what may be tested tragically soon is as we experience the physicality of climate change in terms of bushfires and all these terrible weather events and so on, that some of them which are attributed to climate change, will that kind of spur more action? And, you know, that's yet to be seen yet, but we're moving into that territory where the effects are becoming very real. It's not just an invisible thing. It's here, it's physical, and people can see it. So will that be a force that mobilizes action as if you were sort of being attacked? It would be interesting to see, but we don't know yet, I think.
Yeah, interesting and terrifying, I suppose, in some parts of the world, at least.
Indeed. Well, yes, no, and it's always important to emphasize that. Yeah, absolutely terrifying and tragic in many cases. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, talking about the nuclear military program, in one of your papers, you critiqued the UK nuclear military program, I think. And my question is, couldn't the military nuclear programs in other countries, couldn't they actually be allies for proponents of nuclear power as a green, quote unquote, energy source?
Yeah, no, and they are in many ways. I mean, you know, that's so this is work with Andy Sterling, and what I didn't realize at the time was in many ways we were sort of before, this was 2014-15 when we started doing this. It was the first research project I was on, and we came up with the submarine hypothesis for why the UK was continuing with nuclear power, and that is that it is because the UK needs to sustain the capabilities and skills and supply chains necessary for building nuclear submarines on which the nuclear weapons depends. So although the discourse is very much, it's about climate change, actually what's driving the policy enthusiasm for it is the military. So in many ways, yeah, you're right. I think the military are probably proponents of that. And we see that quite directly. So Rolls-Royce, which builds the nuclear reactors for submarines in the UK, is very much promoting small modular reactors and saying that it will be of benefit to the climate as well. They're also very honest in their 2017 document and say specifically that a key benefit will be to support the nuclear weapons system. I think that is something that is being promoted, and the extent to which military organizations kind of promote the climate rationale for nuclear is a good question, really.
Yeah. So you could also imagine protesters, activists calling to the military for action as well as universities and governments.
Indeed. I mean, yes, stranger things have happened, which would be an extraordinary turnaround, because another thing people forget is that the environmental movement essentially emerged out of opposition to the military-industrial complex, if you want to call it that. So it was in the culmination of the first deep transition, systems had built up which were very much secretive, anti-democratic in many ways, and you had this real tie-in between sort of civil activity and military affairs, certainly in the USA and so on. And the environmental movement was very much started out opposing these centralized civil military systems, and they called for something decentralized. They called for something peaceful. You had these ideas of the soft energy paths, Amory Lovins and other people. And that history of the entwinement, really, of the peace movement and environmental movement has somewhat become forgotten, and somewhat the two of them have become separate as the debates on climate change have become arguably more technocratic and so on. But I think the world, we're in a very different world than we were even a few years ago. So the need to integrate, I think, discussions of peace with environment has become more pressing than ever before, really.
Yeah. Coming back to the deep transitions theory, what do you think? What do these local wars or conflicts that are currently undergoing in Ukraine, in Gaza, what do they, in your opinion, what do they make for the deep transitions theory? Do they play a role theoretically?
They do play a role, and I think something in the deep transitions that we emphasized investors, and we did this with a project we were doing with investors, where they wanted us to look at the climate scenarios that are produced by the ESG, the climate finance groups, and these scenarios really don't include shocks. And they wanted us to include shocks, including wars and these kind of things. And a message that we try and say, and you only need to look at history to validate this, is that the transition is going to involve shocks, and some of those shocks are going to be wars, and it's not going to be a neat linear process. It's going to be interrupted. There's going to be setbacks. It's going to be reshaped by conflicts and wars. And even though these things are obviously difficult to predict and they're difficult to quantify in many ways ahead of time, certainly we need to think about them, and we need to be prepared to respond to them and have resilient systems that can respond to them, because that, increasingly so, there are going to be shocks. And if we look at the wars at the moment, and it's tragic, of course, the picture with the Ukraine war was a very mixed picture in many ways, because you had an acceleration of renewables in Europe, certainly, and you had, for example, Germany kind of vastly reducing its dependence on Russian gas in a short period of time, reducing demand. So you had these acceleration towards sustainability, arguably caused by this. However, you also had the building of liquefied natural gas terminals around Europe, and that increasing. So it's a complex picture. If we look at the tragedy unfolding in the Middle East, there's some analysis that suggests, that part of this is, the part of the story is to do with gas fields in off the coast of Palestine and so on. But also what we have to consider is if it, remember 1973, we could have this all over again. So if this continues, then the oil producing states could switch off the taps, and then we're going to see an energy crisis that would probably sort of dwarf the one that we had last winter as a result of the tragedy in Ukraine. So these are key examples, really, of how the evolving multi-system transition to sustainability is necessarily going to be influenced by shocks. And indeed, something to emphasize is that we're in a different landscape now. So, the landscape category of the MLP, really, in a few years, it's changed. So we've gone from this sort of idea of this global peace. Obviously that was it was an extremely Western-centric view anyway, but there was, in the 2000s and so on, there was an implicit kind of idea that after the fall of the Berlin Wall and everything, it was the end of history. And now we see great geopolitical rivalry. So what the USA is doing, for example, with regards to China and its digitalization and AI ambitions, is to try and cut off its supply of microchips and so on. And there's concerns around Taiwan and all these kind of things. So we're seeing another great power race, really, in terms of artificial intelligence and these kind of things. So, these factors are going to have a massive role in the directionality of the unfolding transition.
What should we study in this regard? For example, a PhD student with an open trajectory or a postdoc who is thinking of a project, you have an agenda or key points, key directions in terms of this topic, war and deep transitions?
Yeah, well, it kind of, what I'd say is it takes off from where I stopped, really, and that is, we looked at world wars, we identified this key idea that shocks do not just interrupt pathways, they fundamentally shape them. But that remains to be tested with other types of wars. I think the imprinting concept is a very useful framework for examining wars, because it actually places attention on what is the dynamics of this war or conflict, and really putting them as central focus, and then trying to understand how they influence. But there's all these events happening around the world, tragic wars and so on, that have not been studied. Other types of landscape shocks, be it pandemics, financial crises. There's a whole, I think, research agenda around using the imprinting concept to examine different types of exogenous shocks, whether they have the same mechanisms, whether there's different mechanisms, how they influence socio-technical systems, the extent to which that the influence they exert lasts over a period of time, or whether it decays. There's all these kind of questions to examine. I think it's only just getting going, really. So that's what I'd recommend is if I had the opportunity, that's what I'd do, is to take that concept further and to examine, go deeper into examining different types of shocks, including wars.
It is a fascinating concept indeed. Do you yourself work on it, or do you want to maybe talk about briefly some of the things that you are working on now, or
great.
Upcoming?
Yeah, well, just a little plug is that me and Johan will have a paper coming out in a special issue, which is in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. There's a number of transition scholars in this special issue, and that paper's on imprinting and shocks and institutional change. And it does discuss the wars again, but it's more bringing together the kind of the core conceptual insights from this body of work. So that'll be out in a month or so, I think. So that would be something. I'm currently working on finishing off a paper on digitalization and the long history of digitalization. And within that, a core part of the story is, again, what I call the World War II regime. So computing, and the entire industry around semiconductors and microchips and so on, absolutely crucially, was influenced by this Cold War context and the institutions that were created in the Second World War, cybernetics and these military ideas of control and prediction and so on, have had a lasting influence, I think, on the directionality of digitalization. So hopefully that will be finished soon. And then we're going to be working in the lab with investors, running experiments to try and help them understand how they can move their investments towards system change rather than system optimization. And within that, I do hope to be, integrating this work on shocks and everything like that. But I wish I had more time to examine different cases and all these kind of things.
Fascinating. I can relate a lot with this idea of system change, system optimization. We're also doing the same kind of similar thing in Eindhoven University in education. Well, that's
fantastic. Okay.
Yeah. Well, we're going to chat about it maybe next time at the IST. So thank you so much. That's all of my questions, Phil. This has been Phil Johnstone at the SPRU. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.